Okay, we'll get started. People coming later than this, we'll just have to catch up. So I'd like to welcome you all to this Bolshevik Tendency online forum on the topic, what is socialism with Chinese characteristics? Does the Orthodox Trotskyist position that China needs a political revolution, is that still relevant? Discussion around those issues. So we're going to have a presentation by Hans-Peter for about 35 minutes. After that, we'll have a discussion round, 5 minutes from people from the floor can contribute, either ask questions or make political points. Then we'll have a summary by Hans-Peter. And depending on how time is, we'll have another round. Depending on how the first one has gone time-wise, we may have to restrict that to 3 minutes, but we'll see how we go. And then we'll give Hans-Peter a summary at the end again. To indicate that you want to speak, use the Zoom raise hand feature. If you're having problems with that, I'll also keep an eye on the chat and you can indicate in there. And as I see people, I'll note you down. We're using the Zoom webinar feature. So when it's your turn to speak in the discussion round, I will change your status from attendee to panelist, whereby you'll come on and be on with Hans-Peter and myself. And you can choose whether to have video on or off. That's your choice. When that happens, there'll be a slight disconnect. Your connection will, for just a second or two, you'll have no connection, but you'll go from being an attendee to a panelist. And then when you finish speaking, I'll be moving you back to the attendees. And once again, there'll be that short connection over a second or two. So we aim to be finished in 2 hours maximum. I mean, we might go a little bit over that if the discussion is really intense, but 2 hours would be our aim. So I'll hand over to Hans-Peter, and he's going to be going for about 35 minutes.
Thanks, Al. Okay, let's jump right in. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party destroyed the bourgeois nationalist forces of the Kuomintang, which represented the Chinese capitalist state. It established a deformed worker state by gradually uprooting capitalist elements within its economy and introducing a system which in many ways copied that of the Soviet Union under Stalin. Just like in the Soviet Union, the economy was no longer run for profit and fundamentally followed a centralized economic plan. Ideologically, the CCP followed Stalin's perspective of building socialism in one country, peaceful coexistence with imperialism, and ruled by a party whose leadership benefited to an undue extent from control over and access to the fruits reaped from the bureaucratically planned economy. The Cultural Revolution resulted in economic stagnation, and after Mao's death, Deng, in an attempt to save CCP rule, started to experiment with market measures, such as the replacement of prescriptive centralized in favor of indicative planning by means of state direction of investment and regulation to keep the burgeoning private sector at bay. The introduction of capitalist measures included the so-called opening up program, which permitted foreign capital to set up plants and employ Chinese workers at a minor fraction of the wages these companies would have had to pay to workers in their own country. This led to the introduction of apparent working conditions across the foreign capitalist sector and their extension to Chinese private enterprises. However, it allowed high-tech companies to produce in China, which permitted the CCP in turn to copy and subsequently upgrade its own industrial base. This resulted in massive economic growth, benefiting not only the top echelons of the Communist Party bureaucracy and the emergent new capitalist class, but even the broader working class and peasantry. The 1989 Tiananmen Square uprising was the first explosion of popular discontent against the market measures devised by Deng, but the Communist Party continued its pro-market course until 2003. By then, public pressure mounted over the sale of state-owned enterprises to their former managers and the widespread destruction of social welfare provided by the Iron Rice Bowl for workers in the state sector. It also led to privatization of multiple state-owned enterprises, ongoing strikes, particularly in the private sector, the enrichment of CCP bureaucrats by openly appropriating public wealth to their own benefit, and a public outcry over these overt signs of corruption forced the CCP to reconsider its course. Following Hu Jintao's leadership, Xi Jinping took over in 2013 and continued a more pronounced course of reining in the capitalist sector, much to the disappointment of the imperialists in North America, Europe, and Japan, who had hoped the gradual extension of market measures would occur at the expense of the state sector, thereby fostering an ever stronger domestic capitalist class, which would eventually dispose of CCP rule and open up China to uninhibited exploitation, like Russia under Yeltsin after the 1991 capitalist counter-revolution. Xi has expressed acute concern about facing a similar fate to Gorbachev, whose market reforms paired with political liberalization paved the way to capitalist counter-revolution, with a devastating effect on the living standards of former Soviet citizens. Since taking over, Xi has increased control over the private sector. As China's financial sector is controlled by 4 state-owned banks, the Xi government consciously provided significantly more loans to the state sector than the private sector. In 2019, over 80% of all loans went to SOEs at favorable interest rates, which were less profitable than their private sector peers. From a capitalist point of view, this form of lending is entirely irrational. Under capitalism, banks would lend to those enterprises which promise the highest returns on investment, so they have a high degree of certainty that the enterprises can pay back their loans plus interest. Yet, despite a significant proportion of state-owned enterprises being unable to repay their loans, the state-owned banks keep lending to them. A crucial reason behind this behavior is that SOEs have a dual role as operating for economic expansion and, more importantly, as providers of a safe income and sometimes housing, education, nurseries to workers' families. State-owned enterprises form the backbone of China's economy, as they are on average far larger in size than their private sector undertakings, making up for approximately 50% of China's GDP and are the source of the CCP's continued power in the economy and broader society. Beijing has circumscribed 7 sectors which are only open to state-owned enterprises, such as military industry, electrical power generation and grids, petroleum and petrochemicals, coal, telecommunications, civil aviation and shipping, and it has also assigned state-owned enterprises a strong share in other sectors such as IT, machinery, automobiles, construction, steel, and non-ferrous metals. Xi has also introduced a large anti-corruption campaign, which went after a number of high-ranking Communist Party members, often factional opponents of Xi, who were charged with embezzling public funds. In a targeted campaign in the coastal provinces, whose economy was dominated by production for the capitalist world market, the CCP introduced higher wages, forced enterprises to have CCP committees represented in their board meetings, with the power to change business decisions, and in a more recent move, to clip the wings of the most powerful Chinese private sector firms, mostly in the tech sector, but also including such diverse areas as tutoring and real estate. Xi's latest moves, combined with increasing imperialist pressure on the People's Republic, have contributed to a growing spectrum of soft Stalinist and Maoist groups and social media personalities who admire China's achievements and view them as evidence that China is indeed en route to become a genuine communist society. This includes a former thinker of the International Marxist Group, John Ross, who has not only landed a job at Chongyang Institute of Beijing's Renmin University, but also recently published a book entitled China's Great Road, in which he makes the claim that Deng's economic measures mirror those of Karl Marx's perspective of an early post-revolutionary society on its way to communism. In doing so, Ross refers to the ever-increasing expansion of the productive forces of a society as a necessity, particularly in China, where the average income per capita stands at a quarter of that of the average US citizen. It is instructive how Marx described the need to develop productive forces under socialism in direct combination with collectivized property forms and economic planning in Volume 3 of Capital. He notes, the actual wealth of society and the possibility of constantly expanding its reproduction process, therefore, do not depend upon the duration of surplus labor, but upon its productivity and the more or less copious conditions of production under which it is performed. In fact, the realm of freedom actually begins only where labor, which is determined by necessity and mundane considerations, ceases. Marx continues, freedom in this field can only consist in socialized men, the associated producers, rationally regulating their interchange with nature, bringing it under their common control instead of being ruled by it, as by the blind forces of nature. It is evident that Marx opposed the presence of market measures in a more developed communist society. In order to justify their reintroduction into the Chinese economy, Deng pointed to Marx's critique of the Gotha program, in which Marx discussed the need to ensure that in the immediate post-revolutionary society, workers will need to retain work discipline and the remuneration would follow the quantities of their relative labor input. Such a society is still marked by the need to incentivize workers to work. Ross and Deng portrayed this as the path that Beijing has been following after the reintroduction of market measures. In fact, their omission of an essential factor in Marx's model described in the critique of the Gotha program, the elimination of an exploiting class and the creation of a society based on collective property where everyone is a worker, shows that Deng cites Marx primarily to justify his cause, rather than being concerned to represent Marx's thought accurately. Marx never envisaged the continued existence of capitalist measures over a prolonged period, even though he indicates that forms of private property may continue to exist in the early stages of a post-revolutionary society in the Communist Manifesto. In his later writings about the Paris Commune and in his conspectus of Bakunin's Statism and Anarchy, he cautions that the demise of private property, even in the early stages of the dictatorship of the proletariat, would have to be, quote unquote, forcibly hastened. When the Bolsheviks introduced the New Economic Policy, or NEP, in 1921, the first example in human history where plan and market measures were combined in a worker state, they did so not because they saw it as a genuine application of Marx's theory of the communist society, but as an admission that the collectivization efforts of war communism during the Civil War had brought economy to a standstill. Therefore, Lenin described the NEP as a very severe defeat on the economic front. The Bolsheviks acknowledged that it was necessary to provide the limited reintroduction of capitalism in the countryside in order to kickstart the economy. This was a defensive measure until agriculture had recovered to such an extent that it could provide for the revival of industrial production in the cities, rather than aiming for a prolonged coexistence between the capitalist agricultural sector and a state-owned industrial sector. They were concerned that the extended use of capitalist measures would result in a constant struggle with the state-controlled collectivized economic sectors over whether state planning or the law of value would ultimately rule. Lenin understood that the existence of a capitalist sector would necessarily engender the formation of a new capitalist class. The revival of this exploiting class would in turn culminate in attempts to establish political representation for the class interests through a counter-revolutionary movement, which would champion the overthrow of the Bolshevik government in favor of a capitalist one. In the Soviet Union, the kulaks, the growing agricultural capitalist class, considered Bolshevik state restrictions on their unhindered economic growth an unwelcome limitation to their profit-making. From the early 1920s onwards, a faction fight shook the Bolshevik Party over whether to pursue a national or international orientation, with dampened hopes of the immediate success of world revolution caused by the defeat of the German Revolution in October 1923. The early application of the NEP had proven successful in stimulating economic growth, and the new party regime around Stalin, which came to power in the wake of Lenin's death in April 1924, believed that it could be continuously used in order to extend early victories in the economic field. The left opposition around Leon Trotsky and Evgeny Preobrazhensky, on the other hand, encouraged carefully crafted increasing economic restrictions on the activities of the emergent capitalist class. They feared that if the capitalist sector grew strongly relative to the collectivized state sector, that the latter would be sidelined, ultimately undermining the worker state. The state would therefore have to play an active part in directing investments towards the reproduction and expansion of the state sector. Stalin ignored this advice. The result was an organized revolt against the worker state by the kulaks, which was brutally suppressed and led to widespread starvation. This ended the Soviet experiment with market measures for quite some time. In China, in 1978, Deng introduced limited capitalist production in order to avert economic stagnation, and today there are first indications that Beijing has to struggle against its own capitalist class. In late 2020, the Communist Party moved against Jack Ma's conglomerate Ant Group. Ma, China's biggest capitalist, had previously expressed hopes that the revitalized Chinese bourgeoisie could win over the hearts and minds of the masses and could reduce the role of the Communist Party in the economy. This compelled the Xi government to move against private owners of Chinese tech giants in recent months to prevent them from undermining the state economy. But it was not just the political and economic mind of the capitalist class that accompanied the introduction of market measures, but also exposure to capitalist crisis tendencies. During the global economic crisis in 2008, Chinese provinces whose local economy were dominated by capitalist firms producing for the world market had to step in order to address the surge of 40 million unemployed. More recently, Evergrande, China's largest private real estate firm, is on the brink of collapse, and the government had to bail out house buyers, and notably not investors. However, whilst occasionally reining in the excesses of the private sector, Xi remains unwilling to wind up capitalist measures within the economy to retain the high growth model. The lack of alternatives for stimulating productivity in the broader economy, other than by applying market measures, means that the CCP will continue to walk a tightrope of an unstable system which exposes itself to the germs of capitalist counter-revolution. Whilst the CCP aims to continue growing the economy, it has no plans to eliminate market elements and embedding forms of workers' control over it. In his 1936 book, Revolutionary Trade, Leon Trotsky described how the Russian Communist Party degenerated into a caste of bureaucrats, no longer concerned with the goal of world revolution, but rather with their own material well-being. In its ability to control the country's economic resources, the Communist Party was able to grant party members in higher echelons benefits beyond those available to the broader population. Trotsky saw the origins of the Soviet Union's degeneration in the Communist Party's bureaucrats' control over the distribution of wealth, resulting in a society which had arrested its development towards socialism and was trapped between capitalism and socialism, similar to China today. Trotsky has described these types of societies as deformed worker states. These states are unable to progress towards genuine communism without a workers' political revolution, replacing the party bureaucracy with organs of workers' democracy, or regress back to capitalism without a capitalist counter-revolution that would dismantle Communist Party rule in favor of capitalist rule. Trotsky observed that the Soviet bureaucracy resorted to the introduction of stricter work regimes, including market measures, in order to raise workers' productivity. Naturally, the goal of the NEP was to do the same, but whilst Lenin not only welcomed the existence of trade unions and granted them the right to strike against the capitalist class, as well as against what he described bureaucratic distortions in the state sector, he also ascribed to them the function of training the workers to manage the economy. By providing such practice, Lenin hoped workers could subsequently play a role not only in immediate production, but also in economic planning. By taking this path, society was gradually going to learn how to operate without a state bureaucracy. Hence Lenin's famous dictum, "Every cook can govern." In his attempts to revive structures of democratic workers' control, such as Soviets, Lenin strove for the working class to become freely associated producers who had uprooted market anarchy and capitalist exploitation. Workers would no longer produce because they were threatened by poverty if they didn't, but because they would understand that their efforts were essential for society to function and develop. Such forms of workers' democracy were absent both in Stalin's Soviet Union and China after 1949, which followed Stalin's model. Strikes were not welcome, and in 1982, shortly after introducing his reforms, Deng abolished the right to strike. Whilst this prohibition is not always strictly enforced, China's Communist Party is not interested in workers' democracy and has repeatedly lashed out when workers raised their heads against the bureaucratic mismanagement and misappropriation of state wealth by party bureaucrats. The party acted particularly harshly against the working class elements in the 1989 Tiananmen Square uprising, which called for democratization and decried the privatization and market pressures applied to the state-owned sector of the economy. A more recent example consists in May 2018, where the CCP arrested workers who had struck against poor working conditions, low pay, and abusive treatment by their managers in the tech company JASIC, which in turn attracted young neo-Maoists who solidarized themselves with the struggle. After being ignored by the official trade union federation, JASIC workers went on strike against the appalling working conditions, resulting in the arrest of 29 of them for quote-unquote picking quarrels. Police arrested a few days later a further 50 workers and students who publicly demanded their release. The Communist Party leadership abolished the right to strike because it wants to exert control over all major economic decisions. In addition, its pro-market wing was often directly involved in reaping the benefits of privatizations by becoming outright owners of previous state-owned property or received bribes in order to provide preferential treatment to capitalists. The conservative wing of the party bureaucracy understands the threat posed by giving capitalism too much wiggle room and tried to limit the most egregious display of wealth by fellow bureaucrats. It has only been after waves of mass strikes, particularly in the coastal provinces, which have a strong presence of firms producing for the capitalist world market, that the Communist Party has started to increase minimum wages. In a more recent move, Beijing even indicated that the brutal work regime of 12-hour shifts on 6 weekdays may be illegalized. Rather than being a genuine workers' government that acts as representative of the will of the broader working population, the CCP acts primarily in self-interest, balancing the defense of market measures to the extent that it considers these to bring about sufficient stimuli to the economy, with restricting these when their outcome riled up the working population too much. The lack of workers' democracy and the maintenance of market measures is completed by the absence of any attempts to spread revolutionary gains abroad. The CCP has generally not sought to disseminate their social model internationally. Deng Xiaoping even cautioned other countries against following China's road. The Communist Party always believed that peaceful coexistence and a joint agreement on non-interference in internal matters would suffice to appease the imperialist world, endeavors which were occasionally put aside if imperialist aggression demanded a more forceful stance. The main task would be to build socialism in one country. In that, the CCP has not shifted since 1949. Its only vacillations relate to the question of how to best achieve this. In 1850, Marx and Engels expressed in a speech to the Communist League that building socialism in one locality was an impossibility, and stressed that the capitalist class would have to be expropriated in multiple of the economically most developed countries to establish an order that, based on its economic foundations, could provide enough for everyone to lead a prosperous life. In their 1845 text, The German Ideology, the two stressed that if a socialist revolution was restricted to just one locality, commodity exchange with the outside world will ultimately undermine such a project, leading to counter-revolution. Building on this internationalist perspective, Lenin and Trotsky established the Communist International as a center for all communist parties to coordinate working class action internationally for the establishment of proletarian dictatorships across the globe and their subsequent federation. In the absence of successful revolutions abroad, Lenin considered it necessary to trade with the capitalist countries, but rather than sitting back and building socialism exclusively within the Soviet Union's borders, he understood that the development of the USSR's productive forces was not counterposed to attempts to further socialist revolution abroad. His aim was to form a bloc of communist countries which would ultimately ignore national borders and establish a socialist world republic with integrated international economic planning and the transfer of technologies to wherever they were required. Stalin abandoned this perspective by adopting the slogan of socialism in one country as an essentially nationalist project of a socialist nation surrounded by a sea of capitalist countries, some of which were economically more advanced, Mao and his successors adopted an identical perspective and focused on domestic development based on peaceful coexistence with imperialism. The profound nationalism that undergirds socialism with Chinese characteristics finds its expression in China's periodic military confrontations with Vietnam, a federal regime exercising its own variant of socialism in one country over territorial claims in the South China Sea related to rights to energy exploration and fishing. Integration into the capitalist world market has come at a price. The CCP had to enforce draconian work regimes against the working class in the capitalist sectors of the economy, mirroring the sweatshop conditions of semi-colonial countries. It had to open the economy to foreign exploitation and needed to ensure a sufficiently attractive investment climate in order to attract foreign high-tech firms to set up production facilities, which the Communist Party was then able to copy. After playing a much larger role in the broader economy, to date, foreign investment accounts for no more than 2% of China's GDP. The People's Republic's economy has dramatically expanded over the past 40 years, and in many technological sectors is only steps away from closing the gap to the imperialist world. Workers' unrest has meanwhile pressured the CCP to enforce increases in the minimum wages and to occasionally side with the workers against domestic and foreign capitalists. Politically, the Communist Party's insistence on peaceful coexistence with foreign capital, encapsulated in Xi's concept of a human community with a shared future, is at best naive in its hopes that the forces of capitalist imperialism could ever accept a political system next to theirs, which does not place the profit motive in the center of all of its considerations. Starting with Obama's pivot to Asia in 2010, the imperialists have placed ever greater military pressure on China as the hopes that the CCP would be toppled by a domestic capitalist counter-revolution driven by the explosive growth of the private sector have not materialized. The capitalist world is in crisis, and whilst this may contribute to an increased attractiveness of Communist Party rule vis-à-vis the free marketeers, it will also increase the objective pressure on imperialist countries to opening up China for full market exploitation. Rather than attempting to build revolutionary parties in the imperialist heartlands, as Lenin and the Bolsheviks did, the Communist Party of China relies on diplomatic efforts to appease the imperialists and some military deterrent in order to defend the nation. Keeping China isolated in a sea of capitalism, which seeks by its very nature to eradicate the People's Republic's collectivized property forms, is not a good bet in the long run. Despite having vastly improved the lives of hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens, the Communist Party has no plans for introducing the kind of communist system Karl Marx had in mind, i.e., a democratically planned economy. Chinese workers are supposed to trust the wisdom of the Communist Party's leadership. Lacking any considerations for workers' democracy, the tactical use of private capitalists in order to stimulate economic growth retains the dangers of fostering a politically conscious bourgeoisie, which will strive to overthrow CCP rule in order to not being restricted by the state economy. It also exposes the People's Republic to the vagaries of the world market in which it is to some extent embedded. The Communist Party of China, in its Bonapartist attempt to balance its foundation of power, the collectivized property forms within the economy, against permitting capitalism to thrive, thus presents an obstacle for a development towards genuine communism in China and elsewhere. While revolutionaries side with it when confronted with any genuine attempts of capitalist counter-revolution, be they instigated by the domestic Chinese bourgeoisie or by external imperialist invasion, the defense of the remaining collectivized property relations cannot be permanently secured by the Communist Party. During the Tiananmen Square uprising in June 1989, workers formed autonomous federations in order to fight against the market measures Deng had introduced. This is the road forward, even though at that point the workers lacked a revolutionary leadership with an internationalist program committed to fighting for proletarian political revolution. Such a revolution would aim to maintain and extend economic planning, with democratically elected bodies composed of representatives of workers and peasants exercising political control. Considering the size and global importance of China's proletariat, Such a revolution would immediately serve as a rallying point for revolutionary workers elsewhere. A party based on the politics of Lenin and Trotsky coming to power in China would seek to establish revolutionary organizations in all countries across the globe and turn the passive accommodation with imperialism exercised by the Chinese Communist Party into a struggle against the rule of capital globally. The Bolshevik tendency seeks to contribute to building such an international party in China and beyond.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. People may have noticed that we were recording that presentation. We'll also be recording the discussion because we think that can often be as clarifying and interesting as the presentations. But we will only be publishing this as audio. So even if you choose to have your video on for the, if you make a contribution, we'll only be publishing this as an audio. So your video won't be being published. So now we've got a 5-minute round. I'll give an indication when you've got about 1 minute left to go. So if people want to indicate that they want to speak, we can get started. And in the discussion, if you want to, you can either respond to Hans-Peter's presentation or to any comment that anyone else has made. So I see we've got Ian there, and then followed by Carl. So let's promote Ian to be a panelist. And there it is. Just want to unmute yourself, Ian. Okay.
Sure, can you hear me? Can you see me? Yeah, great, okay. Yeah, just a few points. I mean, I think the whole of this polemic seems to be against John Ross and socialist action from the point of denouncing their idealisation of the CCP and their apologia for the marketisation of the politics of Deng Xiaoping and his successors. But I think there's something slightly unreal about this. And I mean, that tendency is a rather strange one, to put it mildly. I mean, it's rather what's the word? A sort of an isolated tendency on the Trotskyist left that really are, sort of they take refuge in a sort of like a worship of accomplished Stalinist regimes, and be they're deeply opportunist and look for something to match onto, and don't really have much pretense of being an independent Marxist tradition that we need. I mean, I got thrown out of the Palestinian Solidarity campaign by their people, on a very blatantly opportunist basis. They just grovel into the Labour Party leadership. They'll grovel to anything that's going on. Any bureaucratic leadership they can find, anything that claims to be, anything they can sort of, give themselves some base of support through, in a parasitic way, I think. I don't think they're a serious Marxist tendency. And more to the point is the question of the nature of China. I think it's pretty far-fetched to say that China is a deformed worker state today. And if you look at look at the number of billionaires in China, for instance, it actually exceeds the number in the United States. I mean, that's slightly misleading, because China has got 4 times the population of the United States. But nevertheless, it does actually point to the fact that China is very, very, it's very capitalist indeed. It's not a marginal thing, The Evergrande bailout that happened recently, the Evergrande, economic threat, in a sense, to Chinese capitalism, was that one of the reasons they were so desperate to bail it out was because the weight of it in the economy is at something around 30%, according to some figures that I've seen, the weight of the real estate sector. And that's an indication of an economy that's very, very capitalist. It's not something marginal again. The fear was that there would be some sort of contagion, somewhat reminiscent of of what happened in the United States in the late 2000s. That's what they were frightened of, a real capitalist crisis breaking out in China. I don't think that's something marginal. I think you know, that some of the polemical points that are being made are somewhat unreal. The stuff about you know, the Bolshevik, you know, the whole polemic about the Bolsheviks and the later, you know, the NEP, etc. I mean, Trotsky blocked with blocked with Stalin against Bukharin in the 20s, in the late 20s and beginning of the 30s, because he feared that Bukharin's program of marketization, which is far, far milder than anything that the Chinese bureaucracy has done in the last 20, 30 years, would lead to capitalist restoration. And he prophesied against a neo-NEP that would lead to that sort of collapse back into capitalism. And what he got in China is a neo-NEP. It's gone way, way beyond Bukharin's simply wanted to allow the peasantry to enrich themselves in the countryside. You're talking about, in China, you're talking about strategic large industries as a capitalization. You're talking about wide sections of the economy. Yes, there is a large state sector. You know, I will carry on just a little bit more. I think it is essential to defend China against imperialism, not because it's a deformed worker state anymore. I think that's denying reality. I think China is actually resisting, you know, in a capitalist regime that's trying to stave off being subordinated to imperialism and neoliberalism in a way that's somewhat parallel to Russia. You know, Russia has retreated from the Russian oligarchies have retreated from the neo-colonial servitude that was propagated by Yeltsin's regime, and there's effectively a block between Russia and China and Iran and you know, Venezuela and a whole range of other non-imperialist capitalist countries to provide a pole of resistance against to provide an alternative sort of pole to imperialism and prevent themselves being dominated by imperialism. I think we should give that a degree of support as a resistance against imperialist domination, but I don't think we should dignify it with the type of a worker state which denies reality. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
Yes.
I'll just change you back to being attendee. I've got Carl is next. Just make you honest, and then we've got Neocrene, Tara, and Paul. I see that Marilyn noted in the chat that she isn't sure how to unmute herself. If you just write out your question there, Marilyn, I can read it out for you. When you're ready, Carl.
Yeah, I am. I think you've made a pretty good case that China doesn't fit the Leninist Trotskyist model, or ideas about what they wanted to do or what Lenin or Trotsky wanted to do. It's developed quite differently. Same goes for the Comintern. I was in China 3 different times, and the last time I was there a while back, we had a study class on the party precisely on the question of the Comintern and its impact. And they gave us a list of what they called the 10 two-line struggles that took part in the Chinese party, and how a good number of them were because of the Comintern. Basically, they rejected the Comintern's line in many different ways. Basically, Mao took their money and weapons, and when he got their advice, he put it in the circular file. And it's one of the reasons why they won in 1949. I was going against what the Comintern wanted him to do at various points. So at the end of the class, we asked them, well, should we have a new Comintern? And they laughed and said, too soon to tell, but largely they didn't think it was a good idea because there was always the problem of big brotherism there would be a big brother party, and all the other parties would sort of count out to it. And that was sort of a natural thing. And as much as you made proclamations against it, it probably wasn't going to happen. So my view is, I wouldn't criticize China at all for not starting communist parties all over the place. That's our job. That's not the Chinese job. If there's not a communist party in Britain or Germany or wherever, that's your problem. Same with here in the United States. I don't blame China for not sending over any Beijing gold or whatever to help us build a communist party. It would be counterproductive. As we can see in what happened with some of the old Comintern-related parties, it didn't help out all that much because there were too many strings attached to it. So I think we do best to study China for what it is and what it says it is. And its accomplishments, which are quite remarkable. I don't disagree that there's capitalism in China and lots of it. And but the bottom line question comes down to, is capital in China a ruled class or a ruling class? And my opinion is that the capital that exists in China is ruled. And it's ruled by an 800 million strong Chinese Communist Party. And don't you ever forget it. That's one of the Chinese characteristics, that the Chinese Communist Party is not going to be overthrown. And Jack Ma has learned that recently. He's a member of the party. He got this comeuppance the other, not too recently. Deng Xiaoping, not Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping has taken a recent, turn to curb some of the excesses of the capitalist class and turn some of their wealth over to, the people and to basically to show people who's in charge.
1 minute ago.
So anyway, my point is that's what we would do well to study. The Chinese Communist Party has about 6 or 7 major schools of thought within it. If I were a Chinese worker, I would try to join the party and work in one of the different varying schools of thought to try to work out my ideas.
Are you finished? Okay, thanks, Carl. I'll just click your panel, Team So now we've got I've got a number of people. I've got Neoprene next, then Tara, then Paul, then Jerry, then Michael, and Christoph. You had your hand up, but it's gone down. I'm assuming you do want to speak, but Neoprene is next, making a panelist. And I also have a large question from Marilyn, which I'll take after Christoph. I'll read it out. Neoprene, if you can unmute yourself, please. Neoprene, you need to unmute yourself. Okay.
It's video.
Videos.
But there should be a microphone symbol.
Oh, yeah, we're on. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, am I on? Is the microphone on, so to say?
Yes, we're good now. Yeah.
Yeah. The problem with China for the Trotskyist groups all the decades long was that the starting point was that there was a socialist revolution, that there was a Stalinist slash communist party that had socialism in one country as its program. And as obviously they're still ruling, and as obviously there has not been a tumultuous, violent counter-revolution, the way that happened in the USSR, for instance, with the Yeltsin guys, makes them think then obviously there cannot be a capitalist rule. But if the starting point already is different, if they weren't socialists in one country, but were only the fans of a strong China, when they started, they were not that many socialist measures anyway. They're forced to do some things. They didn't do it in a consequent way, as everybody knows from the Chinese history. But whatever they did, it always had its base that they wanted to have a strong Chinese nation, a strong Chinese national state. And this is what still governs Xi and his actions. And I think that the pure fact that, for instance, they have not privatized, they have industries, and the industries they think that are central for a viable economical future for the country, doesn't make them anti-capitalist. Several capitalist states have had state-owned and directed industries before in the last 150 years, if it was necessary for embetterment for the national successes. This is obviously something the Chinese government has learned. And they were quite successful in this, and therefore they don't see any need to do something different than they did before. Of course, they have to react to social unrest, to political opposition, and they have to think about what they have to do to make China still bigger as it is. But they are on a very successful way in their own aims. And to even ask, should these guys promote a communist international, is so weird in my view, as they don't have the slightest connections to any communist thoughts or programs or traditions. They are nationalists. And as nationalists, they don't need an international. They need a strong air force. They need a strong army. They need a strong connection to countries they are doing commerce with. But communists are never to be found in such a program that the Chinese is very successful doing so for the last few decades. This is all.
Alan, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. We've got Tara, then Paul, then Jerry, then Michael, then Christoph. Then there's a question from Marilyn in the chat, which I'll read out for her. Then I want to make a few comments, and then I've got another comment in the chat from Max, which I'll read out, and then we'll have Jason. So we've got quite a few to go. Just promoting Dara.
Okay. I'm Dara, supporter of the Bolshevik tendency in London. I just mainly wanted to come back on Ian's comments about China being capitalist. Funnily enough, I came across a 2011 report by Joseph Fan and others who found that there are Chinese Communist Party organizations within every corporation in China that employs more than 3 Communist Party members. Now, each party organization elects a party secretary, And that secretary is the linchpin of the alternative management system of each enterprise, which in effect extends their party control beyond the state-owned enterprises, partly privatized corporations and village or local government-owned enterprises into the private sector, or new economic organizations, as these are called. In 1999, there were only 3% of companies in the private sector had these party cells. By 2011, that figure had reached 13%. And to quote, the Chinese Communist Party, by controlling the career advancement of all senior personnel in all regulatory agencies, all state-owned enterprises, and virtually all major financial institutions, and senior party positions in all but the smallest non-SOE enterprises, retains sole possession of Lenin's commanding heights. So what, as HP pointed out, it's clearly the crux of the issue here is the difference between the class character of the state and its economic system. As another comrade said, it's whether the capitalists are ruled or they're ruling or organized as a ruling class. And this isn't a new issue. Leon Trotsky's last major political struggle was against a revisionist faction in the American Socialist Workers' Party, which proclaimed that the Soviet workers' state had been destroyed and a new exploiting capitalist class had arisen. And the chief advocate of this new class theory was James Burnham. And in criticizing what he called a petty bourgeois opposition, he observed that if Burnham were a dialectical materialist, he would have probed the following three questions. One, what is the historical origin of the USSR? Two, what changes has the state suffered during its existence? And three, did these changes pass from the quantitative stage to the qualitative? That is, did they create a historically necessary domination by a new exploiting class? Answering these questions would have forced Burnham to draw the only possible conclusion: the USSR is still a degenerated worker state. But of course, the difference here is that, as the American Socialist Workers' Party pointed out at the time, Mao and co. continued to impose arbitrary restrictions and limits upon the course of the 1949 Social Revolution. The Chinese Stalinists were able to ride into power because the Chinese working class had been decimated and demoralized by its continuous defeats during and after the Second Chinese Revolution.
1 minute.
Thanks. So this idea that a peaceful counter-revolution could have come about, as Trotsky said, is only, so to speak, running backwards the film of reformism. So, to quote Trotsky, finally, we may add, for the sake of complete clarity, if in the USSR today, the Marxist Party were in power, it would renovate the entire political regime. It would shuffle and purge the bureaucracy and place it under the control of the masses. It would transform all of the administrative practices and inaugurate a series of capital reforms in the management of economy, but in no case would it have to undertake an overturn in the property relations, i.e. a new social revolution. And even this was even the case, this was even the case when the Stalinists started to time.
Wind up.
Okay. Well, I'm finished.
Okay, we've got Paul, Jerry, then Michael. Yeah,
I
yeah.
hope everyone can hear me. Okay. Yeah, I first of all, just want to commend the presenter on his presentation. It was very informative and helpful presentation. I also found the article in that was posted on the Bolshevik Tendency site. Marx or Deng is, I would say is very important reading. I would certainly refer people to read that article, as I think it does address a lot of the conversations happening in this meeting. But I think that the couple of points I'd like to touch on is, first, this idea that Chinese communism somehow doesn't have a internationalist history, or is itself not a product of internationalism, is profoundly historically false. I mean, if anybody had a cursory knowledge of the Chinese Communist Party, they know that's not true. Like, even though there was very much indigenous roots for the Communist Party in China, like, for example, in the 4th of May movement and the Shanghai labor movement, and kind of the stars of that movement, Chen Duzhu and Li Dazhao. The fact is that without the the Moscow Gold that Carl alluded to earlier, not to mention the participation of a prominent member of the Comintern, Hank Sneevlet, at the founding Congress, actually about 100 years ago, it almost certainly wouldn't have come to fruition as an organization, right? So I think that that's an important lesson, right? Like, when Trotskyists speak of internationalism, it isn't kind of a an aberration of the general Marxist worldview. It's inherent to it. It's Lenin fully understood that that unless they broke the chain of imperialist power in the East, that the Russian Revolution would suffer. And even though Russia was undergoing severe material, despair or hunger, at the time, they certainly were quite happy to fund the development of a Chinese Communist Party. And even though there, one could say, yes, there was discontinuity, especially after the defeat of the 27 revolution in China, of certainly the leadership and the trajectory of the Communist Party. There's no doubt that that's where its origins are. And in fact, if you look at a movie that was produced this year in China called 1921, oddly enough, it and very clearly under the hand of Communist Party, writers and let's say advisors, those facts about that party origin are there. I mean, it's can't be denied. For all the historical revisionism, so there, I think that's certainly people should study that history, because Trotskyism was very much involved in Chinese history, and that's an important angle to take. As for Ian's raised the China's capitalist argument before, and I think that what can show that it's demonstrably not true is Jack Ma, richest guy in China, billionaire, comes out, criticizes, becomes more and more overtly opposed to the rule of the CCP, first in a veiled way and more open way. He, as Carl said, he got his comeuppance. Like, suddenly he's not available for press conferences, and he's gone from being the richest person to the 4th richest person. I think he's lost about 20 to 30% of his wealth. Like, so that doesn't happen too often in the West. In fact, never. And there's a reason for that. There's one's run by the capitalist class, and in China, it's not run by the capitalist class. I have other points to raise, but given I have about 20
That's
seconds
fine.
left, I'll wrap up. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Jerry next, then Michael, then Christoph. Just unmute yourself, Jerry.
I've got it. Yeah. All right, thank you. All right.
A bit of echo there, Jerry.
Sorry?
There's a bit of echo.
All right. I'll turn off one echo. All right. Okay. All right.
You've made it worse, Jerry. Can you try speaking, Jerry? Hello? Okay, I'll take Michael while Jerry's trying to sort out his, that's there, but we'll leave Jerry there. So hopefully he'll be able to get his computer sorted out. I'll just promote you, Michael, and we'll take you. And so Jerry, if you can just try and sort it out there. But I'll take Michael before you. Okay, Michael, I think you're there. Just unmute yourself. Yeah, there you go.
Hi, yes,
Okay.
thank you. Hi. I was sent, I guess, to represent Red Republicans in America. I would just like to say I generally agree with, honestly, most of the points of this talk. Absolutely. One point that I feel was one thing I'd like to bring up, I guess, sort of a reinforcement of the failure to support communist movements abroad that China has done, I feel like should be addressed, is the case of the Philippines and the ongoing Maoist insurgency there, and how China has still managed to provide material support to the government of Rodrigo Duterte, despite the Philippines currently going under a period of heavy purging and heavy cracking down of communist elements there in the country. And yes, repression. And just another sort of thing that I sort of find interesting also of China is two journals that are like collected with various different leftists of all stripes that I found sort of interesting to provide a sort of supplementary sort of other takes of people from China in outside of the CCP perspective, or the Chuang for the mainland China, Laosan journal from Hong Kong. And yeah, I guess these are the two things I particularly wanted to talk about here. Yeah.
Is that it?
I'd say so.
Okay. All right. Am I back in now?
Yep. Sounds better, Jerry.
All right. Okay, I'll go for it. I do agree with the last contributor about the Philippines, and what happened in 1964 was a direct product of Mao's anti-internationalism, actually, and his two-stage theories of revolution, and his advice to rely on the national bourgeoisie who massacred them, as they did in 1927 in the Shanghai Massacre. There's three missing things, big missing things, I think, about the presentation, although I was very impressed by the presentation. But nonetheless, the missing elephants in the room are the question of the immigrant workers, the Hoku system. The Hoku system consigns all the immigrant workers to second-class citizenship. They have no rights for welfare. They have no rights for education for their children. They have no rights whatsoever. And it has not improved, and it is in fact getting worse. And these are the secret of the wealth producing production in China. It is these super exploited workers that produce the wealth in China, and they are discriminated against on every level, as against the aristocratic, the labor aristocracy in the cities, who are given big privileges. That's number one. I would mention, in fact, that there is a book called The Myth of Chinese Capitalism by one Dexter Roberts, which has curiously almost the same name as the BT's document, but makes these points in absolute lurid details about the way those workers are treated and super exploited. Number two, and Ian has already mentioned this, of course, is the fact that the number of billionaires in China, 1,058 is the latest number, a number more than the United States, though of course not as wealthy as the United States billionaires. But there is also, as well as those billionaires, there's about 5.3 million millionaires. The question then arises, for whom is the wealth produced in China? Is it produced for the mass of the working class? Or is even the state sector wealth produced to enhance the wealth of the billionaires? 279 extra billionaires were added to the number of billionaires in China during the pandemic. And we would have to say that wealth production in China itself is for the enhancement of the wealth of the billionaires, who are the princes and princesses in as they call them in China, in the main. All right, who are very closely related. They're the close relatives of the top bureaucracy. Xi himself is a billionaire. So the billionaire deformed socialist, I think we can take with some skepticism. The third point is if China is a capitalist system, is it an imperialist system? Well, I would say no, that you have to defend China against US imperialism and against its attempts to break it up, etc. You would defend it against imperialism, but its activities in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America are certainly aspiring imperialism. They do want to be imperialists. They are trying to be imperialist, but they can't be imperialist yet because the United States is the global hegemonic imperialist power, which will not allow them to be so. All right, but they certainly want to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Okay, so we've still got a long list. I've got Christoph next, then I've got a question from Marilyn, which I'll read out. I've got a small point for myself, then Max comments from the chat, then Jason, then Kathy, then Charles. Neoprene has indicated he'd like to speak again, but that'll be on a second round if we get that far. Where's Christoph? Yep.
Hi there, everybody. So the forum title is "What is Socialism with Chinese Characteristics?" My short answer is it's not really socialism at all, or at least not in the sense that Marx anticipated it. And I think in a way, my remarks are a response to Karl's claim that 800 million Chinese are running society, which I have a different view on. So I think I want to compare kind of how Marx understood socialism with what is occurring in China today and contrast the two, which I think can highlight where things are at. Marx talked about, sort of the lower stage of communism, socialism in the critique of the Gotha program. He sketched a few things there. And of course, a crucial first step is the socialization of the means of production. And, that occurred in China. Marx also observed that the new society would still follow in the sphere of distribution the principle of equal right, which he defined as a bourgeois right. And he also said that was kind of inevitable because the new society would emerge with the birthmarks from bourgeois society. And really, until the means of production are sufficiently developed, we would see, those kind of different features within the transitional period. So he was very specific that things would not be completely perfect in the lower stage of communism. And he was explicit in it being a transitional stage. He said in the critique of the Gotha program, between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. So that's the concept, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think we can all agree that mathematically speaking, 50% of the concept has been realized in China. We definitely have a dictatorship. The other 50%, the piece of the proletariat, is still missing. And therefore, dialectically speaking, the Chinese Communist Party has really turned the dictatorship of the proletariat into its opposite. Engels talked about the socialization of production would lead to the withering away of the state. Clearly, that is not occurring in China. In fact, what we have observed in a recent period is a resurgence, a reestablishment, a strengthening of the role of the state. So clearly something very different is occurring. And I want to point out a couple of the factors why that is the case. Marx anticipated that the new proletarian state would see an equalization of the income and that the state bureaucracy would no longer be privileged. He explicitly talked about how those people who would administer the state bureaucracy, would be receiving a worker's wage without any privileges. Clearly, that is not the case in China today. We see a huge inequality in China. And we also see that 93 of the billionaires that Jerry mentioned are actually delegates to the National People's Congress. So there is a connection between even the billionaires and the Chinese Communist Party. So clearly that is not the stage of an equalization of income. And the other factor is that socialism, in the way that Marxists understand it, also has the key feature of total control of the representatives in government and state bureaucracy, the concept of election and recall at all times, and that there's a mass participation of the workers in the administration of the state, what we would call workers' democracy. Again, that is missing in China. These are features that are absolutely important, and that's why, from a Trotskyist perspective, we call for a political revolution to establish a workers' democracy in China. That is our perspective. Finished.
Okay, so now I've got a comment and question Marilyn put in the chat. So this is from Marilyn. I realised that there is no system of free healthcare for all in China. That was one surprise. And the other was that neither is there evidently a system of free public education for all from early years until university. It appears that the fact that education for all is not free would largely be the reason that millions of young people have become migrants and headed for the free trade zones on the coast for industrial jobs that have made the free trade zones so successful in dominating the world economy. Are these two flaws in their system the consequence of the market reforms, or was free healthcare and education for all a gain of the revolution instituted as part of the state economy? If so, how was that change possible without mass rebellion? That's Marilyn's question, which you can pick up, or Hans Peter can deal with in his summary. I've got a short point just about the overriding context of all politics of ecological collapse, which is occurring, and how China is responding to that. And if you look at the latest targets and perspectives put out by the Chinese Communist Party in their 14th five-year plan, which covers the period 2021 to 2025, they have some very aggressive targets. They're aiming to make renewables half of the source of all the energy by 2025. The aluminium sector has a target of peaking their carbon emissions by 2025 and reducing emissions from that peak by 40% in 2040. The steel sector also has a target of a peak in 2025 of carbon emissions and intends to reduce those emissions by 30% from that peak by 2030. And coal is obviously a big issue for China. They rely on coal, or have historically done so, for a lot of their energy requirements. And they have, in that coming 14th five-year plan, they're planning to phase down coal consumption, and with an aim of peaking it at 2030. However, against that, in 2020, China commissioned new coal plants, which will generate nearly 30 gigawatts of power, which represents, because China is such a huge component of the world's economy and people, 76% of the world's total commissioned coal plants. And so that balances against somewhat those targets. And then even those targets are targets which are in the framework of the dialogue in international climate affairs, which is the Paris Agreement. And it's fairly generally agreed that the Paris Agreement, and even the latest IPCC report makes this clear, is insufficient. And if you look at the targets of the Chinese government taken overall, I take this from the Climate Action Tracker website, they're insufficient to meet the Paris Agreement and are more consistent with a global warming of 3% over pre-industrial. And that's despite them being some of the most aggressive as compared to most capitalist states. And so that indicates a significant problem. We have that with capitalist states, obviously, and we know why that is, because they are pawns of the capitalists who they rule on behalf of. And so in China, you've got an element of that, because there is some degree of balancing act between the capitalist sector and the state-owned sector. There's also a problem in the nationalist response, that China is just responding with national concerns. And of course, you have the problem which Christoph was just talking about in regards to this is not a democratically decided targets. And that's problematic, because looking at the danger of a catastrophic ecological collapse sometime this century, possibly sometime in the next few decades, if we're unlucky, it seems pretty clear that an internationally and democratically decided, planned response is necessary. And unless we get rid of the Chinese bureaucracy, unless we get rid of our capitalist rulers, that's not going to happen. Okay, next I had a comment from Max in the chat. Chinese Communist Party is communist in name only. The idea that we can tell a Chinese worker he should join this diabolical Stalinist monstrosity to work at his ideas or fight his oppression and capitalist exploitation in China is, to me, probably wrong and shows a very limited understanding and respect for the working class and oppressed needs and their need to emancipate themselves from the capitalists, even if those pretend to be communist. I guess that's a response to Carl. The Chinese worker is there to teach us what is what, not us to condescendingly advise them from our high and mighty false perch of vanguardist professional revolutionaries, which we are not and had not been for decades or more. Among all the American or UK, perhaps that should be European, Trotskyist organisations, we have failed to be actual revolutionaries in anything much more than street demos and paper articles, academia, etc. And I count myself among those failures. So now we've got Jason is next, followed by Kathy, then Charles, and Bob. You had a question. You had made a comment in the chat. Do you want me to read that out or not? Unless you say so in the chat, I'll assume no. So it is Jason.
I thought Hape very clearly indicated the way in which Lenin saw the NEP, the new economic policy, as a retreat, as a sort of tragic necessity to deal with the very real context of the scissors crisis in the early 1920s in the Soviet Union. That was to get money, to get food, moving back into the cities so that the industrial working class, which was the Soviet power's basis, didn't starve, which was a very real possibility at that point. This was in stark contrast to the illusions of the Bolshevik right wing, which then attracted alien class forces to it, which increasingly saw the slogan, "Peasants enrich yourselves," not just as a bug, but as a feature in the effort to build socialism, just as evidently certain portions of the Chinese bureaucracy today view the free trade zones. Nevertheless, I think one misses the forest for the trees entirely if, because of the free trade zone, Chinese market carve-outs, one sees that as a symbol of capitalist restoration rather than the NEP on steroids. One place where there isn't confusion on this is among the imperialist ruling class. Here in the US, of course, we witnessed Trump instigating a so-called trade war with China. Pundits allegedly were shocked because traditionally the GOP, as the party that most nakedly displays itself as the party of pro-business, had traditionally favored free trade. A lot of this was often dismissed as Trumpian madness, right-wing populism, and attempt to attract working class elements away from possible support to Bernie Sanders. But the reality is that this anti-Chinese stance represents a consolidating hegemony in the US on China. We are likely living through the end of the period of engagement heralded by the meeting of Mao and Nixon. In a move that is reminiscent of Cold War II politics, we see Biden as the ringleader of the G7, issuing public pronouncements against China, and a playbook that looks like it's out of Afghanistan, alleging human rights violations against the Uyghurs and looking, it appears, casting around for a new Mujahideen. Of course, the Chinese Stalinists are not known for their delicate touch. So the idea that there are, reasons why people in Tibet, in Uyghur, in Hong Kong should fear the authoritarian state apparatus is not surprising. Nevertheless, it's rather rich that the US, where we're witnessing Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the streets protesting police executions of Black Americans in cold blood, is rather rich in denouncing Chinese policies as genocidal. Biden's role as the ringleader of the G7 has, been every bit as consistently anti-Chinese as Trump, as displayed in the Alaskan conference back in March, which showed that the Democrats are also falling in line behind this consensus. I just wanted to touch briefly. I think it's ironic, but not surprising, that Carl would defend the nationalist outlook of the Chinese Communist Party. That is sort of the lie of socialism in one country is really a key function of Stalinism.
1 minute, Jason.
Now, thank you. Now, not to alibi the Communist Chinese Party in any way, but to, for him to say that, we need to respect what they are doing, essentially not only it bolsters the support there, but also undercuts the idea of international critique and an internationalist perspective. So it's not just abandoning what should be a revolutionary internationalist outlook, but negating the role that we would play as socialists outside of China in being able to critique those policies. And clearly after a century of humiliating defeats begun with the Opium War, there was a nationalist aspect to the Chinese Revolution, and the fact the Chinese Communist Party was built largely out of the nationalist movement that existed in the 19-teens and 1920s. But, to justify that nationalist ideology as opposed to an internationalist ideology is a false consciousness, like siding with Stalin's fatherland propaganda in World War II, etc. I think we need to aspire to something better than that. Thank you.
So I've got Kathy and Charles, and then if someone gets in quickly, we'll be going, I've got Roxy there. Then we're going back to Hans-Peter for a summary. And then if we've got Neoprene indicating he wants to speak for on a second round, so we might take a short second round. Kathy. Okay, just unmute yourself. There we go.
Hi.
It's actually Tom.
It's Tom.
We're having a few tech challenges here. Sorry, so first, let me assure Max that we are not advising people to join the Communist Party in China. Secondly, I'm glad that Hoppe is going to answer Marilyn's questions. I want to take up some of the ideas that Carl put forward because I think they're interesting and germane. First, I would note that in 1845, in German ideology, written before the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels, in discussing the possibilities of successful socialist revolution in Europe at that point, discussed the problem of a revolutionary breakthrough in one country and the difficulty could be presented by being surrounded by foreign capitalist powers.
Sounds very bad, Tom.
You need to speak close to your mic.
Can barely hear you, Tom.
No, because you're holding a phone.
No. You know what? I think maybe we just go on to the next speaker.
So actually, that's quite good there, but we.
Okay, is this quite good?
That's good, yeah.
All right,
Got 3.5 minutes left.
All right. 1845, Marx and Engels anticipate that a successful revolution is going to have to get international extension. Lenin, of course, repeatedly said that the Bolshevik revolution, the Menshevik said, we can't have socialism here because we don't have a working class yet. Lenin said, of course, we're not going to have socialism here. We're going to make a breakthrough here with a revolutionary seizure of power by a very minuscule working class. Then we're going to get extension into Germany, from there to France, from there to England. And very shortly, the whole world's going to be socialist. That was the whole premise that the Bolshevik Revolution was made on. So Lenin didn't abandon that after taking power. In fact, he regarded the seizure of power in Russia as primarily significant because it was going to provide a platform for the rebirth of a genuinely revolutionary socialist international, which became the Communist International. One of the things that we should recall as regards development, China's rather spectacular economic development, which is a very good thing, is that this was conditioned by a deal they made with US imperialism for a bloc against the Soviet Union, which the imperialists regarded as the main obstacle to capitalist hegemony internationally. The Chinese cooperated with the Americans, they were useful. And when the Soviet Union came down in 1991, George Bush Sr. gave a speech in which he said, we're not going to break off engagement with China. We're not going to attack them. We're continuing down this path, because what's happening is they're developing a bourgeoisie that's becoming increasingly important and significant. And this is going to be our battering ram from the inside. This is going to bring China down. Don't worry. We're not going to make them strong as communists. We're going to strengthen a fifth column within them. It actually hasn't worked out that way. We were worried it would, but the CCP has been successful that way. But it's not a sustainable indefinitely situation. They have balanced. They have been successful. They're cracking down on Jack Ma. All of that's good. We don't want to see the gains of the 1949 revolution go down. But it does need international extension. And I think Carl is wrong to think that Lenin was wrong to want to create the Communist International. If you read, John Riddell has produced a series of books that maybe people are familiar with, where he reconstructed the discussions in the Third International in English, and you can read them. This was not a commandist thing. It became that under Stalin, largely initially in relation to the German party. Stalin was worried that the weight of the German party would be felt in the Soviet party, and his faction's attempt to take over could be derailed. So that's a long story. Let me just say, though, that the Chinese Communist Party leadership initially was based on the working class, had a Lenin Trotsky orientation of building a proletarian organization. Stalin ordered them to join the bourgeois Kuomintang. He then ordered them to disarm. Chiang Kai-shek got promoted to be honorary co-chairman of the Communist International. Chiang said, thanks very much. Cut the heads off all the communists. And the only ones who were left was Mao, who was a Bukharinite out in the country organizing peasants. Carl's very right that Mao wouldn't have survived if he'd taken Stalin's advice. But the result of Mao's successful insurrection was a peasant-based, non-proletarian formation that destroyed capitalism but couldn't introduce direct working class control.
That's top. Okay, I've got Charles, then Roxy, and then we'll have a summary from Harpay. Charles.
This is Charles, and I'm speaking on behalf of the International Leninist Trotskyist Tendency, Communist Workers Group in the United States. Our predecessor organizations identified the restoration of capitalism in 1992, I believe, with the 14th Congress and the intentions of the Communist Party to have some get rich first. And now we've seen tens of thousands get rich first, and the working class get the boot. The end of the iron rice bowl, the restoration of the law of value in the countryside, the rise of the princelings, and the expansion of foreign direct investment from China year over year as a massive trajectory abroad, becoming an imperialist country. So it's very important that the Trotskyists see what is going on because of the international consequences of the pending inter-imperialist war being pushed by the United States, especially with the latest maneuver in Australia. We do not take the side of China, but we do identify our main enemy as the imperialist power at home. Now, comrades say that we don't need an international, or China shouldn't be advancing in international. And that's obvious because what are they actually doing? And I haven't heard anybody mention what happened to the Rossing miners in Namibia when the Chinese came in and bought the Rossing mine and the other mine from the Rio Tinto. And then what did they do to the workers there? The same thing that they do to the workers at home when the workers are fighting for a decent contract. They kicked out the workers' leaders from the union, and they brought in their own scab managers and their own scab workers to destroy the union. And we've been taking actions in defense of and alongside the Rossing miners. And we haven't really seen what we saw. One member or supporter of the Spartacists show up, but we haven't seen the Bolshevik tendency show up and defend the Rossing miners. And so same situation with the Petraeus port that was bought by the Chinese. And so what we see is that the Chinese Communist Party, it does have a plan. But its plan, if you read their program, is very clear, is to use capitalism and to basically they've restored the law of value, which is determining the conditions of the workers there and indeed abroad. And so now you have this debt collapse based on building these ghost cities. Because if you had a plan, these ghost cities would be filled with workers and they'd have factories and decent jobs, and they would have medical care, etc. So we think I'll refer comrades to the cwg.org webpage, Class Warrior Volume 1, number 1 can be found there, where we develop a number of years ago, 2013, the issue of restoration, and in the subsequent articles, we show how China has become imperialist. And the consequences of that are very important for all of us who believe in socialism and world revolution, because some of the comrades will be siding with the Chinese bureaucracy against the international proletariat, and some of us will be fighting to defeat the bourgeoisie in both countries. Thank you. Oh, last. Okay, that was.
You've still got 45 seconds.
Okay, I think I addressed the point. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're next, Roxy.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Roxanne. I'm a member of I'm a supporter of the Bolshevik tendency as well. Yeah, I think that the really key issues coming out of this meeting were the ones I expected. The question of internationalism, the question of political revolution and the necessity of that in China. And it's been touched on as well, but the lack of workers' democracy in China, which is obviously directly linked to that. Carl talked about internationalism in a way, and I mean, Jason and Tom have come back on it, but I just think it's so important that I just wanted to sort of put it in my own words as well. Because the one thing that was missing, I wouldn't disagree with a lot of things that you said, Carl, but the one thing that was missing was the idea that the Chinese working class themselves could have agency and actually make change. And so I agree with other speakers that when we talk about the Chinese working class as separate from us, or to take up Max's point, for example, about it being patronizing to tell people what to do, is all missing the point of this absolutely vital, integral part of our program, which is internationalism. So to say that it's not a Chinese problem that we don't have communist parties is not true. It is our problem. And it's a Chinese problem. So conversely, it's our problem that they don't have an independent working class powerful force that can act completely independently at the moment. Because the only way that we're all going to get out of this mess is by having world socialist revolution. And I always find it perplexing when comrades leave this out of the equation. I guess because China is this sort of massive historical anomaly. It's there, it appears to be so powerful in some ways. But of course, what it's doing is it's trying to survive in an imperialist dominated world. But we know that socialism in one country does not work. So to say that it's been working up until now does not mean that it's going to continue to work. At some point, it's going to go either way. Either capitalism will be restored, or we might have a series of revolutions. But let's look at China right now. Like, one of the things we really need to do is just to distinguish between, for example, the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, and the private enterprises in China, because those state-owned enterprises in themselves, I mean, Jerry sort of said that they all also are just supporting the billionaires, which is a complete simplification of what's actually going on. Like, even when you look at those, I mean, Harper will probably come back in that in more detail, but even when you look at what they are providing for workers and the benefits for workers, and the working conditions being so much better than in the private companies, you can see in this kind of little microcosm what it means when capitalism has a grip in China. Imagine that all the private enterprises were just, that was all there was in China, and that's how things were run, and how much worse the living conditions would be. Whereas actually, considering how enormous China is and the history of it being brought out of poverty, we as Trotskyists put that down to the collectivized economy, as distorted as it is, those gains from the revolution that are still visible today. But we emphasize that political revolution is needed. But the reason why I mentioned workers' democracy as well, and the lack of that direct working class power that Christoph also touched on, is that we can also use it as a kind of source of hope, as well as looking at what's lacking. Because throughout the decades, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and of course 1989, workers have shown what their potential is, their desire to fight, and in each case, unfortunately, although some gains were made, being crushed by that bureaucracy, again emphasizing the absolute crucial need to oust that bureaucracy that is keeping workers in check in a brutal way. But the potential of those workers is there, the desire is there. But the tasks of workers in China is different to when we see that potential erupting in other parts of the world, because they already have an economic foundation to work with. They have the social gains of their revolution of 1949. But I'll just end by saying that when they've been more successful, it's when they've worked outside of the official bodies that are dominated by the bureaucracy, for example, the All China Federation of Trade Unions. In each instance, when you go through these struggles, when they have broken free and actually made real gains, it's in spite of the bureaucracy, it's in spite of the ASFTU. And ultimately, I think it's really worth reading up on the Beijing Workers' Autonomous Federation in 1989, the closest thing to a kind of Soviet type formation that China has seen, where
It's
we start
time
to see that
to wind up.
potential. And I'll end by saying then that, you know, ultimately when that polarization happens, I think someone else essentially said it, we're going to need a split in that bureaucracy, and we'll see those who genuinely support the workers and those who are for capitalist restoration.
So that's the end of the discussion round. So we'll have Happy Hans Peter for a summary, trying to answer some of those questions and round out the discussion. We've got some people indicating for another round, but we're going to be right up against our 2-hour time limit. So I think we'll be ending the meeting after this summary, just because if we have another round, we're going to get we're going to be out for at least another half an hour, 45 minutes. So this will be the final summary. Hape.
Yeah, thanks all for the useful contributions. I'll actually focus mostly on the question of whether China is capitalist or not, because that seems to have dominated the debate, not so much whether it's genuine communism. Let's start with the countryside. Carl Davidson has rightly pointed out in the chat that actually the law of value does not entirely dominate the countryside. Farmer families have the right to plots, and those plots served as a social benefits network or web during the global economic crisis for workers in the export sector for the capitalist world market, i.e. migrant workers. And one important difference of the working, or what drives migrant workers into these working conditions is not so much that they lack education to gain some better jobs or anything, but because the working conditions in the countryside where they could work sort of on a subsistence level and produce a bit of what they produce for sale on the market are so much harsher, even though it's hardly imaginable, that a lot of people opt to work in these factories. Obviously, a lot of them regret it as well. What I've seen when I've been to China was, and that's been documented also by a useful book by an American Chinese sociologist, Qingquan Li, it's the title Against the Law, that people from the countryside go to these cities or special economic zones, slave for Taiwanese or American or whatever companies for about 10, 15 years. That allows them to earn higher wages, earn such high wages that they can basically build houses and some luxury and buy some luxuries for themselves in the countryside setting. So when you walk through a Chinese village, you can basically tell sometimes who works in the foreign export sector. That's not to prettify what's going on, but it's also not the kind of primitive accumulation by expropriation that we've classically seen under capitalist development, where farmers are basically driven off their land and then have no choice other than slaving in those factories. The point that Neoprene made, and it's true, as Trotskyists, we think there has to be a capitalist counter-revolution for a social revolution, be it as deformed as the Chinese was, to be defied and to reintroduce capitalism as a system, not just as a component of the broader economy. But it's not just a formality of a formality or a dogma that we just adhere to and we believe it. And social history is actually shown across and certainly in the Soviet space, and they were pretty much the center of those Stalinist formations, had a capitalist counter-revolution by a time-compressed coup in which the pro-market wing of the Communist Party won out against the ones that at least had inclinations to drag on the experiment of the Soviet Union, perhaps with even more market than they had under Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost. Yeah, after that, basically reduced the Communist Party to a minor opposition force, obviously not headed by Yeltsin anymore. In East Germany, in the DDR, I'm originally from Germany, the German bourgeois capitalist class carried out quite a vicious witch hunt against Stalinist bureaucrats across the board and drove them from official posts and so on, regardless of whether they were involved in any particular crimes or not. And clearly that's not happened in China. We have capitalism in a Chinese province, that is Taiwan. But obviously the Communist Party of China and the Taiwanese government are at odds over that particular question as well. So it's the other thing to bear in mind, and the state sector, the existence of the state sector in China, particularly its size, needs to be seen in broader global context, I think. The state-owned enterprises account for approximately 50%. Some say lower, much lower. Some say have even higher numbers of the Chinese GDP. The financial system is entirely, or pretty much entirely, state-controlled. Jack Ma's Ant Group sort of provided some alternative financing models sort of for the private sector, but that's been stamped on by the CCP now. And it actually, the opening up the financial sector to the world market, as the World Trade Organization's membership of China would normally require, is not something that the CCP has entertained. And that shows us something, because the SOE managers are party members. They receive orders from the party bureaucracy, and SOE still are the prime sort of forces that implement the economic plan. True, that there is a relatively large private sector at this stage that has a bit more freedom and can operate within a broader market framework. But even that market framework is nothing like the one that we have here. Paulus pointed to the fact that the richest capitalists in China have been more recently been stamped on by the CCP because they expressed their class instincts too clearly. And I think Carl Davidson's comment that capitalism is ruled by the CCP in China to the extent that he can rule capitalism by political means is an accurate observation. But the other broader question in terms of the laws of motion of capitalism are also interesting to take into account here, because if China was capitalist, how do you explain that they lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty? That's not just CCP propaganda, that's officially acknowledged. These are officially acknowledged facts. And they do it, apparently, according to those who argue China is capitalist, by privatizations and kicking people out of the SOEs, etc., etc. So how does that work? But not even that. It happens in a framework where, at least from the early 2000s onwards, global capitalism is in a major crisis, and everywhere in the imperialist world, but even more so in the semi-colonial world, capitalists are cutting wages, extending working hours, dropping the pension, rising the pension ages, and so on. and China moves in the opposite direction. True. Mostly, or a lot of it goes into the pockets of the Chinese bureaucrats who have wealth that probably Soviet bureaucrats could only dream of. And of course to capitalists who are, as has been pointed out, somewhat entangled with the Communist Party bureaucracy. But the anti-corruption campaign is an interesting one because it's not only using Maoist verbiage to justify going after not just CCP bureaucrats, but they're going after a broad layer of Communist Party bureaucrats who have enriched themselves and show their wealth too ostentatiously. But they're also going after capitalists who overstep the line. And I think those are important features to bear in mind. The other one is that British economists who actually looked at Chinese Communist Party plans, which, you know, if it was irrelevant, then, you know, they wouldn't mean anything, and it would just be a ritual of the Communist Party get together every 5 years and draft up some document that nobody reads and is interested in. But Chris Bramall from Sheffield University has basically pointed out that the economic plans achieve, or the economic growth and in the way that it applies to China has largely been achieved. And if China was capitalist, there would be no plan. Yes, capitalist governments invest, do carry out public investments in one or the other sector and so on, where it's particularly necessary. Living over here in Britain and the US, I guess infrastructure investments would be pretty essential, but the capitalists don't do them because they're not profitable. So I guess that kind of points in an interesting direction. It's true that Chinese healthcare isn't public anymore, or at least I read that 50%. So they privatized it entirely, I think in the late 1990s or so, and then more recently reintroduced state funding for it for, I think, 50% of your cost. And from what I've read, I haven't got the latest figures on how exactly that develops, but the COVID crisis has put healthcare obviously high up the agenda of the CCP. So they've said that they're working on renationalizing it entirely. Again, it's not to be prettified what's happening there, but it allows workers to live a better life compared to if China really was a semi-colonial country. There are semi-colonial countries out there like Mexico or Bangladesh, where workers work in equal sweatshop conditions, but I would bet that their working conditions, and it's actually been proven that the life expectancy and quality of life of not just China but also Vietnam have been over the index compared to the GDP of a country in a global ranking. So that is pretty significant, and that's why it's important to defend the collectivized property forms that still exist. That doesn't mean that, as pretty much everyone apart from Carl have pointed out, that we agree with Communist Party rule and particularly the way that's been carried out. Roxy's pointed to the need for workers' political revolution. They should have an interest in gaining control over the fate of the economy, and they clearly haven't. And
it's a 2 hours. It's 2 hours, so if you can start to wind it up.
Yeah. But Tiananmen, the Tiananmen Square uprising shows that there have been instances where Chinese workers have actually fought back. And without demanding the overturn of state planning. Political revolutions, by the way, there are a few historical examples that that would be of interest, perhaps, if people wanted to read more about those. Hungary 1956 had a similar, probably more pronounced uprising, because workers did actually form workers' councils there. And the fact that, well, the Stalinists in Hungary split, with a section going over to the revolutionists. But also the right wing was perplexed and clearly not involved, because Hungary borders Austria, and so NATO had a direct option to intervene, and probably if the Stalinist rumors were true, that this uprising was capitalist, reactionary, blah blah blah, they probably would have done so, or there would have been a good chance of them having done so, but they haven't, but they didn't. Yeah, on the question of Chinese imperialism, I think that's something that we need to leave to another meeting. That's quite a complex thing, but it might, and we're, by the way, not claiming that that Chinese investments are always happening internationally in the way that, you know, in the spirit of socialist fraternal relations, etc. But they are somewhat similar to those of the imperialists. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I hope you enjoyed the forum, and thanks for attending all.